His shoulder was broken, the arm hanging limply at his side like a loose bag of sand. Sweat forced itself out of the pores on his face and skin peeled off the burns on his hands. It wasn't a good position to be in under the circumstances, and the situation didn't seem likely to improve. But he did have one thing working in his favor. He didn't care if he survived. "You all right?" I asked, cringing at the ludicrousness of the question. He looked up at me, his eyes swollen nearly shut. "Yeah, I'm just peachy," he said, sarcasm dripping from every word. "Sorry, I just don't know what else to say." "Isn't much to say, is there? Unless you want to talk about—" "No," I said before he could finish the sentence. "Let's talk about how we're going to get you down from here." He leaned over, wincing as he did, and peeked over the side of the cliff. "How about you give me a little shove? That should do the trick." "Very funny. You know I'm not going to do that." He glared at me. "Then maybe I should give you a shove and make things quicker." "How about we focus on the positive? You know this only ends one way. If you try to save me, you get killed in the process. Especially with—" "We don't know for sure, okay?" I said, packing up the supplies we had and trying to form some kind of plan to keep us alive long enough to get to safety. "Besides, we've been best friends since what, grade school? If I haven't already been tempted to toss you off a cliff, I'm not going to start now." I stepped over to the edge and glanced down. The wind whipped me in the face, sending a chill through me. Even though it was spring, there was still enough chill in the air to make me shiver. I watched as the sun headed toward the horizon. It would be dark before we got out if I didn't hurry up. My right knee collapsed as he kicked me in the back of my leg. I stumbled, my knees hitting the ground hard, rolling me toward the edge. My hand shot out and grabbed the log, saving me from a horrible death hundreds of feet below. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I said, lying on the ground and breathing hard. "I told you this only ends one way. Might as well get it over with." I stared at him, not believing what I was hearing. "You're serious?" I said. "I thought you were just being—" "You. Look at me. I'm in excruciating pain. My shoulder's a mess. I have burns on my hands and I'm not going to be able to climb down. And even if I could, there's no safety from—" "We have to try," I said. "I didn't bring you here to die. I wish you wouldn't have brought me here at all." There was no way to know this was going to happen. He stared at me. Doubt filled his eyes. I turned away and focused on filling my pack with what I hoped was the right combination of supplies. I couldn't make the pack too heavy because I needed to lower him down and possibly carry him too. I tied together all the rope we had and double-checked the knots. I clipped the carabiner to his climbing rig, checking to make sure it was still intact and the fire hadn't damaged it. I stepped back to admire my handiwork. He was doing the same. "Really?" he said. "This is your big plan?" "Sure," I said, smiling, proud of myself and my ingenuity. "Why not just ring the dinner bell for every predator as you dangle me like a carrot?" "You know what, you're right," I said. "It's not worth all this trouble." I raised my foot and shoved his good arm, sending him toppling over the edge of the cliff. I heard him scream as he fell and then silence. "Thank God," I said, sighing. I was getting so tired of listening to his whining. "I heard that," he said from over the edge. I stepped up and peered over. He was dangling there 10 feet from the top of the ledge. "Oh dang, I thought I killed you," I said, chuckling. He looked up and saw me peeking over. "You bastard," he said. "Well, isn't that what you wanted? For me to throw you off the cliff? How's that working out for you?" He glared daggers at me. "Makes you appreciate life when you think you're about to die, doesn't it?" I said. "You'll pay for this." "For saving your life? Okay, I'll take responsibility for that." I began the long, arduous process of lowering him down. I only hoped I had enough rope. After a while, the strain took its toll. I was exhausted and sweaty. My hands slipped and I had to quickly recover to keep him from smashing into the ground. I managed to slow the rope at the cost of my hands getting rope burn. I tied it off to a tree and leaned over to check on him. "You okay?" I yelled. I couldn't see exactly what he was doing. It looked like he raised his arm, but I couldn't tell. I grabbed my binoculars and peered down only to see he was giving me the finger. "Same to you," I yelled. "I need to take a breather. Will you be all right for a few minutes?" His answer was to slump his head. I guessed he was taking a nap. I sat next to the log and got out a bottle of water, taking a long drink. After a few minutes, I pulled out my knife and cut some strips off of the bottom of my shirt, wrapped them around the palms of my hands and tied them off. Why didn't I think of that before I started lowering him? I thought. I was about to start another session of lowering when I saw the rope vibrating. That's weird, I thought. What are you doing down there? I yelled, stepping to the edge and looking down. My spine turned to ice when I saw nothing. He wasn't there. Adrian, I yelled. No response. Adrian, I yelled again, quickly pushing away thoughts of the Rocky movies. I pulled the rope and it came up with no resistance. I reeled in the entire length and at the end there was no sign of Adrian. The rope didn't look like it had been cut. It looked like it had been torn or chewed. I stared at it for a long time. Memories of the horrible events that led up to this moment overwhelmed me. I collapsed to the ground in fear. My eyes darted around like my head was on a swivel. Every tree became a hiding place for that thing. I could feel it lurking behind every bush. My mind started replaying when the trouble first started. We made it to the top of the cliff and celebrated by starting a campfire and making some coffee while we set up our tents. Adrian was actually in a good mood, if you can imagine, and we stayed up by the fire until well after midnight. The following morning his mood changed. Way to keep me up all night, a-hole, he said, pouring a fresh cup of coffee and looking like he needed it. What are you talking about? Don't play innocent, he said. You know you were hanging around my tent, circling it late last night, growling and pawing the ground, trying to scare me. My eyes went wide as he talked. I swear I was in my tent the whole time. I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. Then what was making all the racket? He said with doubt creeping into his eyes. Maybe I was snoring and you heard that. Trust me, this wasn't a snore. Well, if it wasn't me, then... I narrowed my eyes at him. Wait a minute, I know what you're doing. What am I doing? He said, looking at his coffee cup. You're trying to scare me with some campfire ghost story, hoping I'll wig out. I'm telling you, it's not some campfire story, it really happened. Yeah, okay, I said, making it clear that I didn't believe a single word. I mean it, he said, starting to get angry. Okay, I said, don't get your panties in a bunch. You better, he started saying and then stopped. His eyes were focused on something behind me. I'm not falling for that, I said, refusing to look until I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned and saw. I shook my head to clear the memory. I don't want to think about that right now, I told myself. I need to focus on finding out what happened to Adrian. I stood and checked my supplies, then double-checked to be sure the rope was securely tied to the tree. I avoided looking around for fear of what might be lurking. Then once everything was set, I stared down at the deadly ground that waited for me to make a mistake, muttered a quick prayer, then jumped off the cliff. Rappelling down was more difficult with a pack on my back and rags wrapped around my already rope-burned hands. I took it slow, working my way down the same way Adrian had gone. I also went slow for fear of finding what I didn't want to find. I knew it was possible, so I made sure to be as quiet as I could. The rock face was rough, and I did my best not to knock loose any pebbles or do anything that would announce my presence. In a best-case scenario, his rope got frayed on the rocks and broke. I hoped I would find him laying on an outcropping nearby, unconscious but alive. As I descended, I noticed an opening in the rock wall. My rope was in a straight line with it. I imagined Adrian's rope was too. I stopped and swung myself over to the rock face, grabbing a bigger rock and pulling myself to it. I pulled my rope up and stashed it, then climbed down the side of the opening. There was a small ledge in front of it that I landed on and peered inside. It was dark as pitch. Even though the sun had just set, it seemed like daylight couldn't penetrate the darkness. I pulled out my flashlight and slowly explored the opening with it. It turned out to be a large cave. I stepped inside and walking upright, my head easily cleared the ceiling by a good 3 feet. Curiosity overtook me as I shined the light around this newfound hall of mysteries. There were no markings on the walls and the floor was rough, like the cave had formed naturally instead of someone making it. But then why would someone make a cave halfway up a cliff face where it's nearly impossible to get to? I wasn't sure I really wanted to know the answer. As I continued inside, the air became cooler. I hugged myself and fought off a chill. This cave was much bigger than I originally thought. I walked a short distance before I noticed the smell. Actually, it was 2 smells that intertwined with each other. The first was the smell of fire, not like a rushing wildfire coming to burn me to a crisp, more like a campfire. The second smell was much less encouraging. It was the smell of decay. Some animal had died in here, there was no doubt about it. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if perhaps I had explored far enough. My wondering ceased when I remembered why I was here in the first place. Adrian was still missing. If he had come down here, it didn't seem like he was coerced. At least I didn't see any sign of drag marks on the ground or a struggle. But then again, it was hard to tell on the rough rock floor. I suddenly stopped, unsure of what to do. The passageway split in two. I shone my light at the right one and then the left. Neither seemed to show any clue of which was the correct path. I stared at each for a long moment, then mentally flipped a coin and went right. As soon as I took a few steps, I could feel a strong wind blowing in my face, carrying the smells of fire and rot with it. I nearly backed up and took the other path, but this was where I was most likely to find Adrian. At least I hoped I would. As I walked, I noticed a slight glow ahead. I turned off my flashlight and followed the ever-increasing light. When I turned the corner, I saw Adrian lying on the ground in front of the fire. He didn't seem to be injured. Well, at least not any more than he already was. I didn't see any blood near him. I did, however, see a pile of bones tossed in the corner behind him. It disturbed me to see the pile and think about my friend's bones eventually laying there. I took a step forward to go check on him, then suddenly stopped. The huge rock that had been sitting by the fire suddenly moved. I recognized it right away from the size and the color of the hair that covered it. I stepped back out of view and began shaking. I knew I only had two options: kill this thing or hide from it. There was nothing in my bag that would kill it. I didn't have a gun with me, and I doubted a pocket knife would do the trick. I had to find somewhere to hide until it left. My mind ran in circles trying to think of a hiding place when it dawned on me. I turned and went back to the other passageway as quietly as I could. Once there, I stepped inside thinking it would be a long cavern like its counterpart. However, it was almost immediately blocked. I shone my flashlight on the blockage and was horrified to find it was piled up with clothes. Shirts, pants, shoes, and even the occasional backpack. It was all piled nearly to the ceiling of the cave, and more disturbingly, each article had blood on it. There didn't seem to be any that escaped damage either. Most were ripped or chewed, probably like their unfortunate owners. I remember hearing about hikers going missing in this park, but I thought it was just normal stuff like in any other park. People get lost or fall into some hidden crevasse or ravine. I guess not. My mind screamed for me to get out of there, fast. But I needed to know Adrian was okay and somehow try to rescue him, although at the moment that seemed impossible. The longer I stared at the clothes of these poor, helpless victims, the more it formed into an idea. I grabbed some of the clothes and pushed them aside, digging my way toward the bottom of the seemingly endless pile. I wondered how many missing people it took before a major investigation started. I reached the bottom and took my pack off, setting it beside me. Then I pulled clothes down on top of me, leaving a small space for me to peek out through. There was just a hint of light coming from the mouth of the cave, but it was rapidly dwindling. I slowly unzipped all the zippers on my pack so I had easy access without making a sound when I needed something. I settled in and tried to make a comfortable seat out of the clothes. My conscience was not happy using the clothes of murder victims for comfort, but I saw no alternative. If I ran, that thing would hunt me down. It already found us once. I must have been more tired than I thought. Once settled in, I fell asleep almost immediately. I turned and it was there. I wasn't even sure what it was. It was dark and hairy. It stood on its back legs but hunched over as if readying for an attack. I was petrified. "Adrian," I said. "What?" he hissed. "Is that what you heard?" "Yeah, I'm thinking so," he said quietly, barely moving his mouth as if the monster wouldn't attack if you didn't speak. "What do we do?" I said through clenched teeth. "How the hell should I know?" It was circling us and moving closer at the same time. Its sharp teeth dripped with drool. "Did you bring a gun?" I said. "No, did you?" I slowly shook my head. It stopped and looked at me as though it understood the whole conversation. It stopped lurching and stood to its full height. It must have been at least 8 feet tall. It lunged at me with incredible speed. I screamed and tried to run, but my foot got caught on the log and I fell over backwards, knocking the wind out of me. In the end, that was a good thing. monster lunged at my torso. But since I fell, my torso was laying on the ground with the rest of me. It flew through the air, sailing right over me. I looked over at Adrian and saw his pocket knife in his hand. The monster saw it too. It narrowed its eyes at him and snapped its jaws. I was surprised by how much its head and snout reminded me of a dog. This was my thought as I lay there on my back, helpless, unable to breathe. I watched as it lunged at Adrian. I saw him plunge the knife into its chest and it howled in pain. It never slowed, even as he stabbed it. It merely twisted in the air as it grabbed his arms, pinning them to his side. I heard the crunch as they both landed together on top of Adrian's shoulder. He screamed as they continued to roll right into the fire. Adrian tried to push his way out of the flames, severely burning his hand by grabbing a burning piece of wood and swinging it in a huge arc, smashing into the face of the monster. It whimpered and growled, and disappeared as quickly and silently as it came. It took me a while to be able to move. When I could, I crawled over to Adrian, who was laying still beside the fire. "Are you okay?" I said, rolling him on his back. He screamed in pain as I rolled him onto his injured shoulder. "Sorry," I said. "Get away from me," he said as I helped him to a sitting position and looked at his burned hand. "Are you all right?" I said. "Yeah, I'm just peachy." I woke with a start but didn't know why. I reached for my flashlight and was about to turn it on when I heard the sound of sniffing. I froze. Every ounce of concentration was on being as still as possible. The sniffing got louder. I didn't dare even open my eyes for fear it would somehow see them and that would be it. I could feel its presence getting closer. I fought back the panic that would make me do something stupid like try to run. I just closed my eyes and thought about the last sunrise I had seen, hoping it wouldn't be the last one I would ever see. I felt the snout touch the layer of clothes right in front of me, and then it paused as if it was deciding if it wanted to eat me now or save me for a snack later on. The monster withdrew so silently I barely knew it was gone. I waited for it to return. I knew it was waiting for me to make a move so it could catch me. But I didn't. I sat still as a statue for what seemed like hours. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to move. I had to stretch. I stood and stretched my arms and legs, still quiet. When I sat back down and made sure I was covered by clothes, I risked a little bit of light through my hand to get a bite to eat. Opening a granola bar without making noise is a tedious job at best. It took me a half hour, and after I ate, my only reward was thirst. I sipped on my bottle of water, avoiding the temptation to gulp it down. I didn't know when I would be able to fill it. I checked my watch. It was 1 a.m. At the same time, Adrian had heard the growling. I took a chance that this thing would be out hunting at night. I pushed my layer of clothes off of me, grabbed my flashlight, and went to check on Adrian. I stepped carefully and kept my light pointed at the ground just in case. My ears strained to hear any sounds. Of course, there were the echoes of my footsteps making me whip around thinking the monster was right behind me. I made it to the main cave without having a full panic attack. The fire had burned low, and a dull orange glow lit the walls. I found Adrian lying in the same spot as before. He didn't seem to be moving. I leaned down and listened for breathing. I could hear a faint breath. "Adrian," I whispered, shaking him. "Come on, man, we gotta go." He moved a little. "Adrian," I said, looking around to be sure it wasn't sneaking up on me. "Adrian, come on." He opened his eyes just a slit and put his hand up to shade his eyes from the light. "You still with me, buddy?" I said. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. "Here, drink a little water." I gave him a few sips and he perked up a little. "Why?" he rasped. "Why what, buddy?" "Why are you here?" "I came to rescue you." "Leave me." "I'm not going to do that." In the distance, I heard a howl. It chilled me to the bone. I wondered how far away it was and if it was celebrating another victim. "Okay, listen, I'm going to go, but I'll be back when I'm sure it's out of the cave." I gave him another drink. "You hang on, okay?" He closed his eyes and laid his head back down. I stared at him for a moment, then jumped up and ran out of the cave. I turned at the fork and buried myself back under the clothes, turning off the light as soon as I was set. It wasn't 5 minutes later I heard something lumber by in the cave. I had cut it too close. I needed to make mental notes of when it went out. I stole a glance at my watch. It was 1:37 in the morning. I drank the last swallow of water and lay down in my nest of clothes. I woke up sometime later. The cave was dimly lit. I could see a bright light coming from the opening, but it didn't penetrate all the way to my nest. I could see the walls near the opening, but not much else. As I watched, a massive shadow blocked my view. It was standing right in front of me. I became still as a stone. What was it doing? Did it know I was there? Was it toying with me? Sweat poured off my brow. I knew I was about to die. I gripped my flashlight tight, knowing that it wouldn't do much to the monster, but at least I'd go down fighting. Something fell on top of me. It wasn't very heavy, so I knew it wasn't the monster. I waited for a long moment until I heard it walk away before I used the flashlight to see what was on top of me. I shone the light on the pile and found new clothes. There was a shirt, shorts, underwear, and a bra. I knew it from the monster's latest victim. My heart went out to that poor woman. I wish there was something I could do to help her, but there wasn't. I was barely surviving myself. My water was gone. I had 3 granola bars left, and that was the last of my food. I had to do something before I didn't have the energy to escape. This was my chance. Usually the monster kept to a schedule, I assumed governed by hunger and thirst. I knew it wouldn't go out again for hours. I could leave. I could sneak out and be gone without it knowing I was ever here. But I couldn't. I had to rescue Adrian. But why, my mind said. Because he's my friend, I thought. Would he leave you behind? Of course not. He'd be doing exactly what I'm doing now. Really? That's why he tried to trip you and throw you off the cliff? That wasn't real. He was just joking around. He didn't seem like he was joking. He seemed like he wanted to die and take you with him. He was just upset. How upset do you think he'd be waiting here in this cave to rescue you? Very. He'd probably be wigging out. He never was much for small places. You think he would have left you by now? Maybe. But the important thing is, I'm not him. You could leave right now. No. Who cares if you save your friend and die in the process? I do. Do you really think that thing doesn't know you're here? What? That thing is playing you. It's stalking you, waiting for you to make a mistake. No, I've outsmarted it. I've learned its routine. Keep thinking that. Maybe you can outsmart its teeth as it's chewing you to pieces. I'm not leaving yet. End of conversation. I waited for a response that never came. Even though I had decided to wait, there were things that still bothered me. Was it toying with me? Did it really not know I was here? Why hadn't it killed Adrian yet? Was it leaving him alive to bait me in? The more I thought about such things, the more I felt panic rising inside me. I pushed the clothes aside and the dull glow shone from the mouth of the cave. It called to me. It told me the coast was clear, that I needed to go right now. I felt my muscles tighten, getting ready to rise and run out of the cave. I pushed the clothes over more, clearing a path, when suddenly I heard something. I quickly and quietly buried myself under the clothes. I had barely stopped moving when I heard the monster lumber through. It paused in front of the clothes, sniffing the air, then turned back toward the mouth of the cave and disappeared. I waited for a full minute before I breathed a sigh of relief. My own ingenuity had nearly gotten me killed. I was sure that thing wouldn't be going back outside for hours, and yet it had left within minutes. I began to doubt myself and my own intelligence for taking such a risk. It was time to leave. I dug out from under the clothes and started for the mouth of the cave. Then I stopped and turned back. I had to try one more time to get Adrian out. I went deeper into the cave to the main room with the fire pit. There was a freshly made fire which told me I didn't have much time. Adrian was still lying there beside the fire. I went to him and leaned down. "Time to go, buddy," I whispered. He didn't answer me back. "I know it's going to be tough, but you need to try." I grabbed his shoulders and gently shook him. "Come on, man, you gotta wake up." His eyes didn't open. Something about his shoulders felt wrong. Aside from the fact that one of them was either dislocated or broken and should have caused him excruciating pain, he didn't twitch. The other thing was the shoulders felt cold. Not just a little chilly, they were stone cold. "Adrian?" I pressed my fingers against his neck and felt for a pulse. There was nothing. His neck felt cold as well. I pushed him and his body clumsily rolled over onto his back. I tried to move his arms and legs but couldn't. Rigor had already set it. I stared in disbelief. My friend was gone. Not only was my friend gone, but I had wasted all this time trying to rescue him. Maybe I had killed myself in the process. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and pulled Adrian's body back into the same position. My only chance was for this horrible monster not to know I was here. I stood next to the fire, letting the smoke wash over me in the hope that it might somehow cover my scent. After a couple of minutes, I looked back over at my friend, said a silent goodbye, and walked back out of the cave. I stopped at my hiding place and climbed inside, hoping this would be the last time I waited for death to pass by. I settled in and took a nap to prepare for my escape. A short while later, I woke up hearing the monster pass by. I waited. When I thought it was time, I slowly and silently packed my backpack, then stood to leave. As strange as it sounds, I knew I would miss this place. It had been a refuge of safety for the last 2 days, even though it was a constant reminder of death. I stood at the edge of the pile and tried to rearrange them so that nothing looked amiss. Then I turned toward the mouth of the cave and started making my way out. It was late afternoon and the sun shone brightly in my face, blinding me. I hadn't realized how bright the sun was until I was without it for a couple of days. As I stood at the mouth of the cave, my first problem presented itself. I looked over the edge and it was a good 50 to 80 feet to the ground. That would be why people left the cave alone. They couldn't get to it. I searched the surroundings looking for a solution when one presented itself. There were vines hanging from the trees that looked like they might support me. The problem was they weren't in reach. My arm would need to be a foot or so longer. They sat so tantalizingly close that I had to try leaning out to grab one. That ended when I nearly stumbled off the ledge and fell to my death. I searched for any other way, but there was none. I just had to go for it. I backed up a few steps, then took a deep, cleansing breath and ran. I jumped at the last minute and grabbed for the vines. My hands wrapped around them, but I was already falling and I had to wrap my legs around them too, and squeeze for all I was worth to slow my descent. My hands and legs were burning as they slowed me, but I didn't dare scream. The cave was still too close. Even sliding down the vines may have been too loud. My hands were failing. I didn't know how much longer I could hang on. My fingers let go one by one and I fell. I landed on my back and the backpack cushioned my fall. Fortunately, I had only been around 10 feet from the ground when I did. It still knocked the wind out of me and left me laying there helpless as I looked back up at the cave opening. Only I could no longer see it. It must have been invisible from ground level. Once I could breathe again, I focused on getting out of here. I stood and tried to get my bearings. The sun was setting, so I knew which way west was. It was around 2 miles to the south where the trailhead was. My car, my salvation, waited there for me. I made my way through the trees and headed south when there was an opening. Before I knew it, I had run across a trail. I stepped onto it, feeling more relieved than I had in days. Then I heard something in the brush behind me. I froze. I turned toward the sound and saw the predator. It was a mountain lion. Not the horrible monster I had just escaped, but it didn't matter if this cat was hungry. I'd be just as dead. I tried to nonchalantly continue walking on the trail, hoping it would lose interest. My walk turned into a power walk and still the lion followed. It seemed to be closing the distance between us without breaking into a run yet. I tried to remember what to do in case of a mountain lion attack, but all I remembered was, don't run. I thought of this as I power walked away from the pursuing cat that was getting closer by the minute. Suddenly I was hit from behind. The lion had jumped on me. Fortunately, it had jumped on my pack. Its weight held me down, making me helpless as it climbed up my pack heading for the neck. I covered my head and neck, hoping to survive. I could feel its hot breath against my fingers. I knew an attack was imminent, and then it stopped. It lifted its head and I could hear it sniffing the air. In an instant, it leaped off of me and was gone. I sat up and looked around, not believing my luck when I noticed the forest had gone silent. The only reason a predator runs away like that is there's a bigger predator in the area, my mind reminded me. I had a very good idea which predator had scared it off. This was it, fight or flight. I jumped up and ran at a full sprint down the trail. I didn't know I had that much energy left after the last 2 days, but death is a great motivator. And I knew this thing wasn't coming to congratulate me for escaping its lair. My legs burned. I had a stitch in my side. My backpack was throwing off my balance and I nearly fell. But I could see the trailhead. There was a glint of metal that was on the front bumper of my car. All I had to do was keep going. I could hear panting behind me. My footsteps weren't the only ones running on the trail. It sounds more like a gallop behind me. For a fleeting moment, I almost stopped to see if I was being chased by a horse, but I knew that would be a fatal mistake. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the keys, pressing the button and unlocking the doors. I didn't want to make the same mistake I'd seen in dozens of horror movies. I was one of the ones screaming the loudest when the victim dropped the keys. I ripped open the driver's door and dove inside. I had just shut it when a nightmare landed on the hood. I stared at it for a moment, transfixed by this horrific apparition. It looked like someone had taken a dog and turned it into a horrible beast. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall. Its fangs were sharp and red. They drooled onto the windshield as the red eyes stared at me. It reached back with its paw and smashed into my windshield, nearly breaking through. I woke from my stupor and started the car as it smashed the windshield again, this time breaking through. It shoved its snout inside and snapped at me as I put the car in reverse and floored it, turning hard and making the beast tumble off to the ground. I threw it in drive and stomped the pedal to the floor. The car lurched forward with rubber screeching in protest. I gained momentum when the monster landed on the roof with a crash. It began pounding over and over. I saw claw marks coming through the metal and into the cloth on the ceiling. In desperation, I began swerving back and forth, trying to shake the monster loose. Metal and rubber protested at my maneuvers with the extra weight on top. I wondered if the car would flip and end my escape in bloody fashion. So far, the road had been a park drive that was never meant for such speeds. I knew there was a hard turn coming up and I wouldn't make it as fast as I was driving. I slammed on the brakes, sending the monster flying. I stomped on the gas and swerved around it, continuing to gain speed. As tempting as it was, I knew if I had tried to run it over, my car would never survive. And right now, survival was all that mattered. I looked in the rearview mirror and impossibly, it was catching up to me. I saw it leap, trying to land on the car again, but I swerved in time, leaving it only asphalt to land on. I made another hard turn, and I was on a state road. The monster followed me, but I was able to get enough speed to finally escape. I breathed a sigh of relief as I sped toward town. I didn't bother going home. I went straight to the police department. After waiting a half hour to make it to the front desk, I was finally interviewed by an officer. When I started my story, he seemed to be only mildly interested. By the time I was done, there were 6 officers standing around listening. That was one hell of a story, the officer said, looking around at the other officers smirking. It's true, I said. The officer sighed as the others dispersed. I'm sorry, son. As entertaining as that was, I'm too busy to go chasing around the woods hunting after some urban legend. I took a piece of paper off his notepad and wrote down a series of numbers. What's this? He said when I handed it to him. I had my GPS with me, I said. Those numbers are the location of the cave that has all the evidence you need. Listen, son. Without something concrete, there's no one who's going out to the middle of the woods chasing a fairy tale. Well, maybe that'll help, I said, getting up and setting my backpack on his desk. I opened the zippers and dumped clothes out of them. Whoa, what is this? Concrete, I said. These are the clothes of this thing's victims. If you take DNA samples from the sweat and blood on them, you might find matches to some people who have recently gone missing. You're serious, he said, looking from the clothes to me as if just waking up. Yes, I said as I got up and started toward the door. If it's not too much trouble. I walked out, leaving several officers staring at the pile of clothes. I got into my destroyed car, hoping it would start, and headed home. The entire way I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. After all this, there were 2 things that captured my thoughts. 1, I would be barricading my house as soon as I got home, and 2, I wouldn't be sleeping soundly ever again. I was heading back into town with my buddy Joe after spending the weekend out on a frozen lake, ice fishing and drinking beer. The fish were really biting too. Joe's SUV was stuffed to the gills with wall-eyed smallmouth bass. The northerly town of Kapuskasing was buried under a mountain of snow, the worst snowfall since the winter of '97. I've lived my entire life in northern Ontario, so I've seen my fair share of snow, but nothing like this. You learn to expect the unexpected in northern Ontario. We were heading over a steep incline, enjoying a generous backdrop of pine trees painted in freshly fallen snow when tragedy struck. We watched as 2 police helicopters landed on the small slice of highway, causing the trickles of traffic to grind to a halt. Not a good sign. This highway was the only road home. We later learned that a newlywed couple had collided with a transport truck, killing both the husband and wife. We were forced to turn around and head back over the hill, where we found ourselves driving through a modest-sized hamlet consisting of one stop sign, a gas station/motel restaurant, plus a smattering of wartime houses. Except, all you could see was the pointed rooftops. The houses were completely submerged in snow. It was an incredible sight, something you only see this far up north, and even then this was rare. Joe didn't want to stick around, waiting a good 12 hours for the road to clear. He had a wife and kids to get home to, so we pulled over, wondering what our next move should be. Joe had that look in his eye, the look he gets when he's about to do something dangerous or stupid or both. I know this look well. "Hand tight," he said. "Hold on." He turned onto a crude version of a road, the kind designated for snowmobiles, with stop signs standing a mere 3 feet tall. The road was extremely narrow. Snowbanks as high as trees were towering over us like large, looming walls of white. If anything were to approach, we'd have nowhere to go. There wasn't enough room to turn around. I was becoming increasingly uneasy. This is how people get hurt, or worse. "Are you sure this is safe?" I asked, hating the sound of my voice. He was busy white-knuckling the minivan through the snow-tunneled trail, the glare of the setting sun blinding us the entire time. We drove for 15 minutes, knifing our way along the icy road, which was bumpier than a wooden roller coaster. It was obvious that we shouldn't be here. The impending darkness didn't improve my mood one bit either. I had a bad feeling about this. Joe stopped the van, asked, not trusting the look on his face. Joe didn't answer. I could see his mind at work, assessing the direness of our situation. "I've got to turn this thing around somehow," he finally said. I couldn't see how this was possible as we were sandwiched between 2 colossal snowbanks. Something flickered inside Joe's dark eyes. "What's that up ahead?" he asked, flashing on the high beams. "I think it's a road." It was. We edged a bit further, stopping at this makeshift road. There were no signs or road markings to be seen. Nothing. In fact, this road looked worse than the one we were on. "Let's see where it goes," Joe said, cranking the wheel. As the minivan lumbered down the unmarked road, an ominous feeling swept over me. It was impossible to ignore. We were in trouble. There was no denying it. We were completely off the grid. Not even Google Maps could save us. There was only one way to go, straight. The road was leading us into the dark of the forest, and when you're this far north, that's never a good idea, especially at night. That's when the wolves come out. It was looking to be a moonless night, which didn't help us one bit. Joe's hands were quivering as he clenched the wheel, keeping us from skidding into the towering snowbank. He kept assuring me we'd be all right, but I've heard that one before. Joe slammed on the brakes. "You see that? Over there." I squinted my eyes. "Look," he said. "Fire." Deep into the forest, I spotted a small flickering flame dancing blue and orange, yellow and wild. Probably a campfire. Just then, a strange and disturbing sound crackled through the night like a howling wolf. "You hear that?" he asked. The animal cried out again. It was the loneliest yowl I'd ever heard. There it goes again. It sounded like a wolf, except it didn't sound like any wolf I'd heard before. And I've heard plenty. Whatever it was dangerously close. "Wolf," I said nervously. As soon as those words left my mouth, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared out of nowhere. Joe stopped the minivan and killed the lights. "Be still," he said. I did just that. I sat motionless beside him in the car, but my hands were shaking. Those laser red eyes were approaching at an impossible speed. "Reach back and grab the gun," Joe whispered. I tried, but it was out of reach. They were on his side, closer to the back. Those glowing eyes flashed on and off, and for a moment everything was still. And from out of nowhere, the beast lunged onto the hood of the van. We screamed in unison. The thing was huge, unlike any animal I'd ever seen. It looked like an overgrown German shepherd, except it was standing on its hind legs like a human. It was snarling at us, making ungodly noises, thrashing about. The creature was long and gangly, frothing at the mouth, clearly rabid. "Dogman," Joe said, clearly astonished. "I don't believe it." Joe gunned it, looking to run the thing over and speed away, but the wheels were caught on ice. Without warning, the beast leapt off the hood and started scratching at my door, its claws like daggers, tearing the door from its hinges. It smashed through the windshield, shattering it into a million pieces. With its dog-like face twisted in rage, the thing took a swipe at me, its long, toothy claws just inches from ripping my eyeballs from their sockets. The SUV shook, spilling the cooler of dead fish. The smell was atrocious. The dogman disagreed. Before it could rip apart my throat with its curvy claws, the creature turned from me and trampled to the back of the van, where it devoured the fish in seconds flat. Its muzzle turned blood red. Watching it lick the fish guts from its paws was sickening. This isn't how I wanted to die. The dogman's razor-sharp teeth were on full display. The insidious brute seemed hell-bent on killing us both. We were, in fact, the main course. It took a tentative step toward us, licking its filthy face. I gave Joe a look that said, "Nice knowing you, pal." When out of nowhere came an ear-ringing blast, striking the creature in the shoulder. The thing screamed in protest. Then came another shot, hitting the beast square in the chest. Blood and gore spilled like wine across the interior of the SUV. "Someone's shooting at it," Joe proclaimed. 3 more shots rang out. Snarled, wiped the fleshy cartilage from its bloodied face, then attacked. Bang! The shot went wide, but it was enough to send the beast scurrying back into the woods. "Holy hell," Joe said in a shaky voice. Without a second thought, he pulled his seat back as far as it could go, then shimmied his way into the back of the van and grabbed the gun. "We're gonna need this," all of a sudden. Freezing. With the vehicle off and the windshield busted in, it was an igloo inside the van. "It's getting cold in here, eh?" I said, shaking uncontrollably. A large plume of steam escaped from my face as I spoke. I was in shock. I had no idea what that thing was, but it damn near killed me. The scene inside of the minivan was that out of a horror movie. The smell was even worse. I tried opening the door, but it wouldn't budge. Joe tried his door with the same results. We were stuck. I'd sliced myself to shreds before I got halfway through my windshield. Joe's door had a bullet hole where the handle should be. We'd have to escape through the back. Blood and guts and fish bones and all. It was gruesome, but we did it. Once outside, I scanned the area, searching for that dog creature that almost killed me, but it had vanished. Joe's shotgun was aimed at a speck of light approaching from straight ahead. A car. Within minutes, we were greeted by a Volkswagen microbus. It stopped directly in front of us. The driver got out and ran toward us, carrying a sniper rifle, wearing a belt of ammunition. He spoke fast and with purpose, checking his surrounding while doing so. "You saw it. You did, didn't you?" "Excellent. Which way did it go, by the way?" This guy made Clint Eastwood look like a Boy Scout. I honestly thought he was going to kill us. He frowned as he surveyed the scene, and he shrugged. "I suppose you'll be needing my help." He ran to the bus and opened up the hatch, exposing an array of military-style weapons to the likes I'd only seen in the movies. "Holy hell," Joe said, clearly impressed. I remained quiet, unsure what to make of this heavily armed, red-headed stranger who literally just appeared out of nowhere to save our lives. But there seemed to be no other choice. Whoever he was, he drove us back to his cottage, regaling us with the history of this dogman creature. Told us some pretty tall tales. His name was Patrick. Apparently, he's a dogman hunter. He says he's never captured one, but claims to have seen 4 or 5, wounding 2 of them. Pesky bastards, he says. Hard to kill. He'd been hunting the one that attacked us for weeks. Apparently, it's been mutilating deer and coyotes, as well as regular cats and dogs all winter long, leaving their salvaged remains scattered along the sides of the road and in people's backyards. The locals were starting to panic. Joe and I texted home. Then we stayed up all night talking about dogmen. I was having a hard time coming to grips with all this, seeing as how I almost died at the hands of one of them. Joe, on the other hand, was enthralled. The next day, we drove back to the SUV to inspect the damage. When we arrived, the van was completely dismantled and destroyed. It lay in ruins. Everything inside it had been ravaged and plundered. "This isn't right," Patrick said. "There must be an explanation." We scanned the surrounding area for over an hour and came fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, making track finding next to impossible. The disappointment on Patrick's face was palpable. Reluctantly, we hopped into his microbus and he drove us home with our tails between our legs, where we arrived a day late and short one SUV. We stayed in touch with Patrick going forward. "Joe, Coming from a long lineage of seasoned hunters, was intrigued by this dogman creature. Naturally, I was skeptical. I'm fairly certain that beast meant to eat me. The last thing I wanted to do was volunteer to go searching for it. Yet, unbeknownst to me, this was the making of a team of hunters. Dogman hunters. Still, amidst all the excitement, a feeling of trepidation had stolen over me. There was a lesson to be learned from all of this. A lesson lost on my gun-toting counterparts. Some roads are best untraveled, especially in northern Ontario, where anything can happen and usually does. I grew up during the 70s in a little place called Vernon up in British Columbia. It's a nice enough place, I guess. Good place to raise a family. But after scrapping my way through high school, I was faced with a sort of bleak future. I didn't really like the sound of working menial jobs around Vernon for the rest of my life. But at the same time, I didn't want to just pack up and leave. I liked Vernon. All of my friends and family were there, but most of the jobs available to me involved punching the clock for someone else. I knew I couldn't listen to some idiot hoser give me orders all day, and neither did I want to be a cop or a fireman or anything else that paid good money without a degree. All I wanted to do was work on motorcycles. Only thing was, I didn't have a motorcycle, nor did I have the money to buy one. And minus expenses, I'd be working some crappy McBurger Hut job for 18 months before I could afford even the cheapest of the models I was interested in. And that's my uncle let me know about a logging company up near Lumbee that was looking for workers. I don't know what it's like these days, but it was easy to become a lumberjack back then, mainly because you'd have to be half crazy to want to do something so dangerous. To compensate, the pay was really generous, and since you didn't even need a high school diploma, it was a popular choice for guys who had the stones to do such a hazardous job. You gotta remember, this was the late 70s. There weren't all those safety regulations like you have today, where even the asswipe has reflective safety strips on it. People got hurt back then. It was just a thing that happened. And when I first started as a lumberjack, there were guys who said that I wouldn't make it a month without picking up my first scar. I figured if I was careful, I could beat the odds and make it the 7 months that I needed to work to be able to afford a bike without getting myself hurt. I was right. And it turned out all that fear-mongering was just a way of screwing with a new guy. But another guy I signed on with, same age, same sort of background, he'd lost his life out there in those woods. And to this day, I don't think the cops know who did it. So just a few months after I started, this other kid my age signed on named McNally. The kid's first name was Adam, but everyone just called him by his surname, and we didn't really work together much, so I didn't know much about him as a person, but I heard stories, and they weren't good. Kid was quiet, kind of lazy, kind of weird, and he caused all kinds of problems for the crews that he worked with. He was always late, even when we were staying out at logging camps where he had literally no place else to be. He'd disappear for an hour at a time, and the guy started to think that he was off getting high or something. But since the crew chief couldn't ever find any drugs on him, all they could do was give him warnings until they had enough on him to fire him. And then one day McNally just disappeared. The crew he was working with said that he just walked off into the woods, saying that he needed to take a leak, and then that was the last they saw of him. We weren't at a logging camp at the time, so the other guys on his crew figured that he just quit and walked back into Lumbee without telling anyone. I mean, they didn't even really notice that he was missing until he had been gone for about 3 or 4 hours, and even then, they only did a quick look around the area before reporting back that McNally was gone. Next morning, he doesn't show up for work, so we figured that he's gone for good, and just carry on with our lives. And then a week or so later, and I only heard this secondhand, his mom showed up at the foreman's office. She was worried sick and hadn't heard from her son since the day he walked off the job. But rather than just call the cops, she spent the past few days driving around looking for him. That was another big reason we figured McNally was into something illegal. Why wouldn't his mom just call the cops right away, especially if she was so worried? The only reason I can think of is that she didn't want the cops finding him before she did, but that's just a theory, I guess. And maybe an incorrect one given what happened next. Anyway, she asked us to keep an eye out for him, and then a couple of days later the cops showed up. I don't know what was said between the police officer and our foreman, but the next thing we know, we're being asked to help the cops walk through the woods near where McNally went missing. The foreman didn't seem too happy about it, and I think maybe the implication had been that one of us had something to do with McNally disappearing. If that was the case, I can understand him halting operations for a few hours to make us pitch in, like a show of good faith or something. No one objecting to pitching in either, especially since it potentially involved one of our own getting hurt. McNally was an idiot, no doubt about that, but he wasn't a bad kid, and seeing his mom all shaken up definitely lit a fire under a lot of guys' butts. We grouped up, and then the cop that showed up organized us into long lines and then marched us through the woods in the direction McNally had gone missing. We walked like that for quite a while, keeping our eyes on the ground, and there came a point where I was long past thinking that we weren't going to find anything. But then right when we were talking about turning back around again, one of the guys on the far right flank started calling out that he'd found something. We all rushed over to see this single solitary boot just laying there in the dirt. It's not like we knew the exact make, model, or size of the boots McNally was wearing, but somehow we all knew it was his. Knowing we were headed in the right direction, the cop called us off the search and thanked us for our time, then got to calling in some backups so they could continue the search properly. All the crews were abuzz with this idea on what had happened, and some guys were pretty skeptical and thought that we were making a whole bunch of fuss out of nothing. All we'd found was a boot, one that had probably slipped off after he'd walked off to get high or something. Others seemed to be convinced that we had a full-on murder investigation on our hands and that the prime suspect was one of our number. Personally, I didn't know what to think, not until they found McNally's body out there in the woods. We had cops coming in and out of camp for the next couple of days, but never in huge numbers. And then one day we showed up to work to a whole flurry of activity, and it didn't take long for us to figure out why. The cops wouldn't really talk to us about what was going on. Their chief spoke to our chief to explain what was going on, and then as the rumors started to swirl, the press got wind, and then there were reporters on the site before we knew it. They were very much focused on talking to us than the cops were, but there wasn't much we could tell them. We just knew that it was bad based on what little we'd overheard the cops saying. From what we'd heard after the cops found McNally's body and photographed the crime scene, they had to transport the pieces of him back through the woods to a waiting coroner's truck. Pieces of him, not a whole body, just pieces. Based on that, we assumed it was some kind of animal attack, or at least that an animal had gotten to his remains after he died from whatever else it was that killed him. But then a few days later, the cops showed up to the lumber yard with a search warrant, and then after they turned the place upside down, they left with 3 members of McNally's lumber crew with the intention of questioning them at the station. At that point, some of us got to thinking, holy crap, did McNally's crew just get sick of him and decide to disappear him? But the idea seemed insane. He was one more mess up away from getting fired, and if they had a problem with the guy, they'd just tell him to his face, not take him out into the woods and saw him up like the freaking Lumbee Chainsaw Massacre. And lo and behold, they were released without charge and they never heard from the cops again. But it was definitely a time when they thought that it was one of us that had killed McNally and that we'd cut him up with a saw once we were done. But then after a while we found out why none of us had actually been charged with the murder. The cops had ruled it out fairly early, and McNally's body had been cut up into pieces when they found it. But it hadn't been cut up like with a chainsaw. His arms, legs, and head had been torn off, before being stacked all neatly in a little hollowed-out tree trunk. The last part was all but confirmed by the local cops when they refused to flat-out deny the rumors of how McNally's body was found. Everything else is still rumor as far as I'm concerned, all unconfirmed. And I honestly hope they stay that way too, because some of the things I've heard since are enough to curdle your blood. I'm mainly talking about things I heard on my last month or so on the job. I stayed on for a while after I bought my Harley just to squirrely away for some savings so I could move down here to Phoenix. And in that time I heard a lot of scuttlebutt involving how McNally met his end. I don't want to speculate on what that might have been. I heard some theories that sounded a little too disrespectful to the dead, but I'd rather not take part in what amounts to rumor spreading. But I've often wondered what happened to McNally out there, if it was a debt, or some other criminal thing catching up to him, or something else entirely. Because if it were anything in that something else category, something more or less inexplainable, then it could have just as easily been me out there, ripped up and stacked in a hollowed-out tree trunk with all the agony in the world still etched on my cold, dead face. The summer of 2008 was a rough time to graduate from college. I had just spent 4 years getting a degree only to find that the job market had all but dried up. As bummed out as I was about being unemployed for the foreseeable future, I found a deep appreciation for backcountry camping and hiking that summer. Growing up in the Rocky Mountains and graduating from a college in western Montana, I was not a stranger to hiking or camping. But that summer it became an escape to the point of an obsession. Going on daily hikes and camping beneath the stars really helped my mental health while I worried about my life's purpose and my future. It was June and unseasonably cold, wet, and cloudy. The daytime highs barely touched 50 degrees, and at night it dropped below freezing. Despite the weather, I had planned to hike around the Anaconda Range that week, and I wasn't going to let that deter me. My plan for the week, funny enough, was to hike from Storm Lake over Storm Lake Pass and down to Upper Seymour Lake. Storm Lake, actually an alpine reservoir, is a challenge to get to and requires a 4x4 pickup and some skilled driving. The road is a narrow 2-track winding its way through thick pine forests. The way was slick with rain, but I made it to the top with little heartburn. I set up camp on the north shore of the lake and decided to do some fishing. The fishing was miserable. It was cold and nothing was biting. But the best thing about bad fishing is that my thoughts were free to wander while I sat on the shore. The rain was a constant light drizzle and created a natural white noise. Time passed and my daydreams were cut short as a low rumble from up the canyon overtook the sounds of the rain. The rumbling was not unlike a distant diesel engine. There are no roads that go beyond where I was camped. No machinery or vehicles could be up that canyon. Maybe it's a plane, I thought, looking up into the rain clouds. But the sound wasn't getting closer or farther away, and the sound wasn't above me. It came from beyond the lake and up into the canyon. The sound was stationary and constant. This was most certainly not a plane or a truck or a bulldozer. All of this wasn't outright scary, but nonetheless my hair stood on end while I sat there listening. After 20 minutes the rumbling faded away and I was left again with only the sound of raindrops. Soon enough I caught a decent-sized trout, cleaned it, and headed back to camp to get ready for dinner. The fish cooked up fine, but to be honest I hate trout. It's edible, sure, but totally unappetizing. It tastes like mud. I ate as much as I could stand and tossed the rest into the lake. Building up my fire for the night, I sat back to enjoy the evening with a bit of whiskey. Night came fast. The mountain ridges put the sun to bed early and the rain clouds obscured the starlight. It was dark, really dark. The sounds of a crackling warm fire and the rain bouncing off my tent were a great comfort and starting to lull me to sleep. I reminded myself I needed to build up the fire before bed. I walked over to my pile of scavenged firewood and grabbed an armful. Being away from the fire's crackling, I could pick up that all-too-familiar rumbling rising in the background. It was growing louder than before, and closer. I may have had a few too many pulls of whiskey and was tired and grouchy. This noise was ruining my camping trip and my buzz. Frustrated, I yelled into the blackness of the night, "Hey, shut the fuck up, asshole." Like a switch being flipped, the rumbling stopped, and so did the rain. My heart skipped a beat. I realized that was not a convenient coincidence. There was an intelligence out there, something sentient, observing me and responding to my screams, and I wasn't getting the most positive vibes from it. I threw all the logs on the fire and retreated back to my tent. More on edge than ever, I just sat there, listening to the fire crackling, to my rapid breathing, and beyond that to the silence of the darkness. Before this moment I had felt alone but safe. Now I felt alone and vulnerable. Beyond where the firelight faded, I felt there were a million eyes in that dark watching me. My paranoia began to subside when the rain suddenly started again. Not a drizzle, but a massive downpour. I was glad I had built up the fire, or it would have been snuffed out for sure. My tent was being pushed down by the force of the storm. I thought about bailing to the truck, but knew I'd be soaked to the bone instantly. Risking injury or death over getting wet is the kind of logic only whiskey can produce. I could feel the rainwater pooling and moving under my tent. This storm wasn't letting up. The urge to get in the pickup and drive away was ever more tantalizing. I could get my stuff tomorrow in the daylight and spend a few nights in town. But I'd had a bit too much to drink. Driving, especially on that slick, muddy 2-track road, would have been a death sentence. But I still needed a safer place to sleep than a wimpy tent. Grabbing what I could, I ripped open the tent flaps and ran for the truck. I was soaking wet by the time I settled into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Turning the heat on full blast, I hoped that would dry me out. It was going to be a miserable night, though. I reclined my chair and tried to calm my thoughts with deep breaths. The rain wasn't letting up. I was warm from the heater, and I was riding the crest of a good whiskey buzz. The fire was still raging despite the rain and kept the campsite well lit. I remember the truck's clock reading 1:06 a.m. I blinked. It was only a moment, but when I opened my eyes, the rain had stopped. It was foggy and quiet. The once raging campfire was just embers, and there was morning twilight to the east. The truck's clock now read 5:45 a.m. It was morning. That couldn't be right. Almost 5 hours gone in the blink of an eye. I must have passed out. My head was killing me. I didn't feel like I had drank that much to justify that kind of hangover. I turned off the truck and stepped out to survey the night's damage. My tent was completely flattened. The tent poles were shattered to pieces. Everything was soaking wet. Smothering the remains of the fire, I dragged all my junk to the pickup and tossed it into the bed. My hike over the pass wasn't happening today, that was for sure. It was around 6:30 a.m. before I finished picking up camp. As I climbed into the cab of my truck, I heard the rumbling again through the morning fog. I drove out of there as fast as I could down that muddy bobsled track of a road. Not once looking in the rearview mirror once. I have never been back to Storm Lake. I probably never will.